Hello, everyone, and welcome back to, I believe, our fourth. I think this is a 1 month, our fourth stream, our fourth episode, talking about Julius Caesar and the Gallic War. I thank you all for joining me here today. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can follow us on Wednesday nights, well, night being Japan night, at 6 p.m. Japan time. If you're on Twitch already, well, you can also follow on YouTube. Twitch.tv/AuthorValentine is the name. I had planned today to go into the normal text like I usually do, very refined, and I try to get a good reading experience for everyone to hear and listen to so that they can be really driven, as I am driven, by the words and the history of the greatest leader of men in the history of West, if not the history of the world. And we're still going to be doing the reading. That's going to be part of the stream. So if you're here for that, then don't fear not, fear not. That is coming. I'm going to be showing my face here in a minute. I don't usually do this on this stream. I stream other things where I do reveals, so I'm going to be bringing my big old ugly mug on the screen just so you can see what I'm about to talk about right now, because the BBC, the British Broadcasting Network, which has basically become a menace to everything that not only Britain, but the rest of the entire Western world should stand for, is releasing a documentary on something that, well, something that we talk about here almost every day, and that's Julius Caesar. So I wanted to actually watch this on with you all here. And then I wanted to talk about it before we get started today. And I know it's a bit unusual. And if you're just listening and not watching, and don't worry, it's not necessary that you watch the screen. Just hear the words and then I'll talk about it. But let me go ahead and shift over. And we can take a look at this. I'm going to go ahead and turn the volume a little bit up. Hopefully it isn't too loud for you guys. So this is it. It's a 30-second preview of the new BBC, The Making of a Dictator. Look at this first frame. And you can tell this is the evil Caesar. And he's out to get you.
Caesar, most extraordinary political story in Western history.
Julius Caesar is the most dangerous kind of demagogue.
He's immoral, he's irreligious, he wants to rule Rome.
The city is uncontrollable.
Democracy has to be fought for. Take it for granted a new Caesar will come.
There were a lot of people speaking there. And I want to go through each one at a time. Because with the exception of the very first person who talks, Tom, who is, by the way, Tom Holland, who wrote Pax and Rubicon, who's a very well-known modern historian. The rest of these comments are so asinine that I find it hard to believe that any historian with any kind of integrity would want anything to do with this kind of project. One more time. Well, one by one.
Caesar, most extraordinary political story in Western history.
The most extraordinary political story in Western history. This will be the only true statement, besides kind of one other. That was Tom Holland.
Julius Caesar is the most dangerous kind of demagogue.
The most dangerous kind of demagogue. Yes, clearly. The general who bent over backwards at every opportunity to save men who were trapped behind enemy lines, who protected his allies when his predecessors did not, whose will left a huge amount of his wealth accumulated over his life to the people of Rome, who worked to enlarge the middle class, to reduce Big Olive and the slave-driven markets, is the most dangerous demagogue.
He's immoral, he's irreligious, he wants to rule Rome.
He's immoral, he's irreligious, he wants to rule Rome. So Julius Caesar was elected to a position in Rome called Pontifex Maximus. It means he was the Pope of Rome. It means that, in fact, he was very religious and keen to make good with the gods. He was, in fact, much more moral than many other Romans you see in his contemporaries. For what we're talking about in Gaul, for example, he forgives and pardons and lets the tribes keep their land at nearly every single opportunity in the wars. He wants to rule Rome. Come on.
The city is uncontrollable.
That's true. There were riots at the time, but we'll talk about those later. That wasn't when Caesar was in Rome.
Democracy has to be fought for. Take it for granted. A new Caesar will come.
Ah, yes. And there it is. There's the crux of the issue. Right there. Democracy has to be fought for, or else the goblin Julius Caesar or someone like him's gonna come take it from you. Because Julius Caesar ended the Republic and stopped democratic elections from happening. Oh, fuck, he didn't. He didn't. That's right, this is actual bullshit. This is actual bullshit. You know, when Cleopatra came out, Netflix did a Queens of Africa or something. They did a Cleopatra video on the Black Cleopatra. Actually, she was stronger than any leader of her time. I didn't say anything. I was just like, well, I just won't watch it. Because I figured that after such a colossal failure, no one would try to repeat this process. How could they? How could an actual business, a studio, actually look at this and say, hey, why don't we get some of the same people who worked on that, historians, and bring them back, and let's go shit on and make stuff up about another important historical figure. The worst part about this, and I think the biggest betrayal, is the fact that they get someone like Tom Holland in there. So now it's like, oh, you know, a lot of people probably don't know the others who were the other faces who were there. People know who Tom Holland is. So he's going to bring in an audience. And that audience is going to watch this. And they're going to be like, oh, wow, I didn't know anything like this. This is great. That's what's going to happen here. And now you know what we're going to get? We're going to get more people like Historia Civilis or overly sarcastic productions or Dan Carlin, for Christ's sake. We're like, wow, man, Julius Caesar was actually a genocidal maniac, and there was a Celtic Holocaust. It's because of him that we're missing one of the great cultures of the West. How many historical figures of our own are we going to assassinate? How many times are we going to recast them? How many times are we going to try to tell the next generation that everything that came before was wrong or evil, and then just change the truth, just literally making shit up? They are making shit up. And part of this, I think, is because historians inherently have nothing to do. This might shock people, but historians don't actually go and make history, okay? Important people make history. Historians write about it. But the problem is, when you have modern Roman historians, unless there's some large archaeological find or a new text that's discovered, what are they doing? Well, oh, they're reading the books that you can just go and read and then writing new books that has their opinion on it. And they have to do this. They have to do this or else they don't have a job. But then they shouldn't have a job. Because they're just making shit up. And it pisses me off. It pisses me off that everyone just goes out and sees this shit. No one bothers to go and actually read any of the source texts. And we're stuck here with these companies who are just constantly filling this up, right? They're just like, it doesn't matter if they lose money. The money doesn't matter anymore. Do you know the name of the BBC studio that made this, by the way? Let me tell you, the name of the studio, you might just think it's made by the BBC. No, this is the actual tweet. Or do they still call them tweets on X? I don't know. It says, produced by BBC Studios Specialist Factual Productions. That is the name of the studio. I am not making that up. That is word for word. BBC Studios Specialist Factual Productions. That's right. It's made by specialists in the facts. Don't you know? The Specialist Factual... Well, if it's made by the Specialist Factual Productions, then shit. It's got to be full of facts by specialists. And if you're not on board with this, then you might as well just be part of the alt-right. I mean, you might as well carve a swastika into your forehead because you're just believing alternative facts at this point. I mean, these are experts, right? They've got published books. I mean, these are peer-reviewed. We've made a society that actively is in a race to hate itself more than the previous generation or even the previous year has. Everybody feels like you have to be the first to point out how bad a certain person was that wasn't considered bad last year. It has to be Abraham Lincoln. Before that, it had to be Thomas Jefferson. Well, he had slaves, and slavery is really bad, so we got to look at that. Abraham Lincoln, well, he did fight the Civil War, but he didn't really care about the slaves. And he didn't really do it because of the slaves, so, I mean, can we really even call him the man who freed the slaves, since that wasn't his original intent? He's actually quite a bad man. How long is it going to be before you're the bad guy? How long is it going to be before someone's writing something about you, or whatever group you're part of, and you've become the villain? At this rate, it's not going to be long. This has to stop. Julius Caesar defined the West. He made Rome what it was for 1400 years, essentially. Thank you for the raid, Tasteless. You're here in the middle of my rant. So, I hope that if you're watching this, that you do not watch the BBC documentary on Julius Caesar. You should actively protest it. You should tell them how disgusting they are. You should tell Tom Holland that he's disgusting too for being part of it. For putting your name on it. I would never want my name on something like that. No matter how many buckets of money they showed up at my door with. It's disgusting. Alright. It's enough rant. Today, we're going over Book 3 of the Gallic War. The year is 56 BC. On the Roman calendar, the year is 698 AUC, which is the year since the founding of the city. The consuls of the year are Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Marcellinus and Lucius Marcius Philippus. Those are our two consuls for the year. The title of this chapter is Campaigning Against Maritime Tribes, Crassus and Aquitania. For those of you who missed last time or just need a refresher, previously Caesar was sent against the Belgae, who were forming up an army of about 200 or 200 to 300,000 men in northern Gaul, Belgae territory. And he got word of this. He marched north. He befriended a tribe called the Remi, who were the southernmost of the Belgic tribes. And together with the Aedui, who were running some distraction campaigns in the west, he managed to defeat the Belgae army, including the Nervi, and he essentially pacified the north of Gaul. For those of you who are new here, this is Julius Caesar's The Gallic War, commentaries on the Gallic War. Caesar does write about himself in the third person in this, so if you're hearing Caesar, this isn't someone talking about Caesar. This is Caesar writing about himself and what's going on. Remember, these are meant to be read. So it's not too weird to be referring to yourself in the third person in this context. So let's get started. When Caesar set out for Italy, he sent Servius Galba with the 12th Legion and a section of the cavalry to the lands of the Nantuatus, Veragri, and the Seduni. These lands reach from the territory of the Allobroges, Lake Lemanus, and the River Rhone, up to the peaks of the Alps. His reason for sending Galba was that he wanted to pass over the Alps, which traders habitually used, albeit with great danger, and on payment of a heavy toll to remain open. Caesar gave Galba leave, if he considered necessary, to post his legion in the area for the winter. Galba fought a number of successful engagements and stormed several of the enemy's forts. They all then sent him envoys, surrendered hostages, and made peace. Then Galba decided to station 2 cohorts among the Nantuatas. He himself wintered among the Viragri, with the remaining cohorts of his legion, in a place called Octodurus. This village, which is set in a valley, has no large area of level ground around it, but is bordered on every side by lofty heights. As it was also divided in 2 by a river, Galba left 1/2 of the village for the Gauls, and after evacuating its inhabitants, assigned the other half to his cohorts. He fortified the place with a rampart and a ditch. Several days in winter quarters went by, and Galba gave orders for corn to be transported to Octodurus. Then suddenly he learned from scouts that during the night the Gauls had left the part of the village he had allotted to them. Also, that the heights which loomed over the village were occupied by a great host of the Seduni and the Viragri. The Gauls' decision to renew hostilities and attack the legion had emerged for a number of reasons. First, they were contemptuous of a legion below full strength, which was short of 2 cohorts, as well as a number of men sent out in small groups to forage for supplies. Moreover, because the ground was uneven, they thought that when they ran down from the heights into the valley and threw their missiles, our men would not even be able to withstand their first assault. There was also the fact that they were aggrieved because their children had been taken from them as hostages, and they were convinced that the Romans were trying to seize possession of the peaks of the Alps, not just to make their route easier, but in fact to take control of them forever, and to annex the lands bordering the province. Work on the winter quarters and the defenses was not quite completed, nor had the supply of corn and other necessities been adequately secured, for Galba had assumed, following the surrender and delivery of hostages, that there was nothing to be feared in terms of an attack. On hearing this news, therefore, he quickly called a council and asked for opinions. The threat had arisen most unexpectedly, and they now saw that almost all the heights were filled with a host of armed men, so that there was no chance of help arriving, or of supplies being brought in, as the access routes were all shut off. Hope was all but abandoned at the council. A number of men declared opinions to the effect that they should abandon the baggage, charge out, and march to a place of safety along the same route by which they had come. The majority, however, resolved to set this aside as a last resort, and in the meantime to await the outcome of events and to defend the camp. In this brief interval, they had just enough time to arrange and contrive matters in the way they had decided at the council before a signal was given and the enemy began to charge down on them from all directions, hurling stones and javelins at the rampart. At first, while they were still fresh, our men fought back bravely, and none of the missiles they cast from the rampart were cast in vain. Also, when any section of the camp had lost its defenders and seemed to be hard-pressed, they ran to bring help. But they were at a disadvantage because the fighting went on so long, and because when the enemy grew weary, they could leave the battle and fresh troops took their place. None of this was possible for our men because they were too few in number. In fact, not only were the soldiers who were fatigued unable to retire from the fighting, but there was no opportunity even for wounded men to give up the place where they had been posted in order to recover. The battle went on for more than 6 hours without a break. Our men were running out of weapons as well as strength, while the enemy attacked more fiercely as our men grew weary, and began to break down the rampart and fill in the ditch. Then, as the affair came to a desperate climax, the senior centurion, Publius Sextius Bacchus, we mentioned his numerous injuries in the battle against the Nervi, together with the military tribune Gaius Volusinus, a man both sensible and brave, ran up to Galba and explained that their one hope of salvation was to try a desperate remedy and attempt a sudden sortie. So Galba summoned the centurions and told the men to leave off the fighting gradually, and just to intercept enemy weapons and rest after their efforts. Then, after the signal, to sally out from the camp and put all hope of safety in courage. The men did as they were told. They made a sudden sortie from all the gates of the camp and gave the enemy no chance to realize what was happening or to close ranks. Now the positions were reversed, and men who had come in hoping to take the Roman camp were all encircled on all sides and put to death. The total number of Gauls who had come to the camp was reckoned at more than 30,000. More than a third of them were killed, and the rest were terrified and put to flight. They were not even allowed to make a stand on the heights. Once the whole enemy force was routed, and the bodies of the slain were stripped of their arms, our men returned to the camp and their own defenses. After this battle, Galba was reluctant to take risks too often, and remembered that he had taken up his winter quarters with one set of expectations, but had come face to face with an entirely different set of circumstances. He was particularly worried by the shortage of corn and supplies, and the next day burned all the buildings in the village and set out to return to the province. No enemy barred his way or held up his march. He led his army to the lands of the Nantuatus and then the Allobroges, where he wintered. After these events, Caesar had every reason to think that the whole of Gaul had been subdued, the Belgae beaten, the Germans expelled, in the Alps the Seduni overcome. So at the start of winter, he set out for Illyricum. He wanted to visit these peoples too, and acquaint himself with the area. Suddenly, however, war broke out in Gaul. So let's take a brief sidebar and talk about what happened. Most people might think of Italy, or rather, not Italy, but the Republic at this time as including the Alps, but in fact, it does not. The Alps are held by several Gallic tribes, 3 of whom Caesar just mentioned. And this poses a problem because if you want to, of course, travel from Italy over into Gaul, of course, you can go along the coast. You can go, towards Massilia, Narbo in the south, up towards the Allobroges, who were just north of them, which is where Galba ended up. But for traders, for transport, things like that, if you could get through an alpine route, of course, that would be a bit more direct. However, because these tribes are lodged in there very, very well, that creates difficulties, and it creates a huge amount of danger for the merchants and the troops in this case, of course, too, if you're trying to move an army in and out, to come back and forth over that route. So Caesar mentions he wants to open it up. And so Galba is the man he chooses to do it, and Galba fights some battles. He wins. He takes hostages, which, remember, I always feel like I have to say this, hostages are not people held at gunpoint in this situation. They're usually the children of the aristocracy, the wealthy citizens of a nation. And they are, brought into the Roman camp. They're not, held in cages or anything. They're just, they're there as an insurance policy to keep the tribe from doing something crazy that they come from. And so Galba figures, well, we've defeated them in battle, we've taken hostages, we've reached terms. This is the important point. We've reached terms, the Gauls have agreed to it, they've surrendered hostages, what do we have to fear? And if you remember, in the previous year, in the Belgae territory, Caesar also had a similar situation. He marched against one of the Belgae tribes. I think it was the Ottawatuki or the Bellavaki. I'll tell you guys. Ottawatuki, that's right. The Ottawatuki were one of the Belgae tribes that Caesar was going to war with, and who went to war with the Romans, and Caesar defeated all the other Belgae. They came to the city of the Ottawatuki, and the Ottawatuki had fortified it, so Caesar began, getting the siege works ready, the siege towers, and building them up, and the Gauls, specifically the Ottawatuki, had never seen anything like this before, so they were like, to hell with this, let's surrender. And so they surrender. Caesar orders them to bring out their weapons, to surrender the weapons. And the Ottawatuki agree to it, but actually, they didn't turn in all their weapons. They were keeping a huge reserve inside their city. And that night, very late, when they were hoping the Romans would be off guard because of the so-called peace that had been established, the Ottawatuki stormed out of the city and tried to overwhelm Caesar and the legions. And this is a recurring theme we're seeing now. So this is the second time it's happened, and it won't be the last. We're going to see the fake surrender become a very common tactic in the Gallic War. They're going to send out envoys, they're going to negotiate, they're going to reach terms, they're going to agree to it, and then they're going to immediately get betrayed. This is a very common thread in this war. And you have to think, we're still actually relatively in the beginning of the conflict. We're in 56 BC, and Vercingetorix, the siege of Alesia, that isn't even until 52 BC. That's a ways away. So, and this whole thing started just 2 years prior, in 58. So, you have a growing situation. People imagine Caesar. Dan Carlin does this, and I hate this, but he always has to talk about him like he's a Star Wars villain or a Disney villain. He literally calls him Darth Vader or the Emperor. Like he has this some grand design that goes out into 20 years in the future, and he knows every step before you make it. And he's playing 4D chess, and everyone else is just trying to keep up. That's stupid. Okay, that's how you would paint a cartoon villain. What's more likely, and what I believe, is that he's getting into these situations at the behest of the Gauls most of the time as well. He's fighting these battles. He's negotiating treaties, which he is making in good faith, and he's assuming good faith on part of his opponents after a surrender, like you would if someone's surrendering to you. You're trying to work out a peace. And now, for the second time, that peace is getting betrayed, and it's at the cost of Roman lives. The lives, remember, of his men. Many of them he knows personally. He knows by name. Again, remember, Caesar was very close to his men. He was very interested in not only the glory of it all, but the survival of every man he had under his command. He didn't want to just throw lives away. So that brings us now to, believe it or not, another betrayal of terms. So give me one moment here while I fetch my water, which for some reason I left in the kitchen. Mute the mic here, and I'll be back in a jiffy, and we will continue on with this chapter of the Gallic War. All right, we're back. I was too excited there. So excited I forgot my own water. Caesar, where we left off, remember, he was planning to go visit Illyricum For those of you who don't know, Caesar, at the end of his consulship, was awarded governorship, or he was the proconsul, appointed proconsul, of 3 different provinces. 2 of them were where we're centered a lot in the Gallic War, so that's Transalpine Gaul and Cisalpine Gaul. And the 3rd one is Illyricum, which is over in the east. And Illyricum gets, sadly, very neglected during this conflict for obvious reasons. So he's trying to get over to Illyricum, but while he's on his way, he gets news that war again has come to Gaul. So let's continue reading. The cause of the war was this. Young Publius Crassus, together with the 7th Legion, had wintered beside the ocean, among the people called the Andes. There was very little corn in those parts, so Crassus sent some prefects and military tribunes to neighboring states in search of more supplies. Among them, Titus Tarasidius was sent to the Esubi, Marcus Trebius Gallus to the Curiosalate, and Quintus Villanius and Titus Silius to the Veneti. The influence of the Veneti is very great indeed along the whole coast in those parts. Not only do they have a very large navy, which they use for voyaging to Britain, but they also excel in nautical matters, both theoretical and practical, since moreover they live beside a particularly fierce and open sea, with only a few exposed harbors under their control. Practically everyone who regularly sails in their territorial waters must pay them a tax. The Veneti took the initiative by detaining Silius and Villanius, in the expectation of using them to recover the people they had surrendered to Crassus as hostages. The Gauls are impulsive and sudden in their decision-making. The neighboring peoples were influenced by the authority of the Veneti, and detained Trebius and Tarasidius on the same grounds. Envoys were quickly dispatched between their leaders, and they swore an oath. They would only act by common consent, and would all bear the same outcome of fortune. They urged the other states to choose and maintain the liberty they had been given by their ancestors, rather than endure enslavement to the Romans. The coastal peoples were all swiftly won over to this point of view, and they sent a united embassy to Publius Crassus. If he wanted Silius, Villanius, Tarasidius, and Trebius back, he must return their hostages to them. Crassus reported these events to Caesar, as he was some distance away. Caesar then gave orders for the building of warships on the river Loire, which flows into the ocean, the appointment of oarsmen from the province, and a muster of sailors and helmsmen. These matters were soon arranged. Then, as soon as the time of year allowed, Caesar made his way to his army. The Veneti and other states heard of Caesar's arrival, and realized how seriously they had wronged him. They had detained envoys, who had always, in every nation, been entitled to be treated as sacrosanct, and put them into chains. So they began to make ready for war, in accordance with the magnitude of the threat, and in particular to prepare what was necessary for their navy. They were especially confident because they put their trust in the nature of the territory. They were aware that on land the roads were intersected by inlets, and that it would be hard for the Romans to travel by water, since they were unfamiliar with the area and harbors were few. They were convinced, moreover, that our armies could not remain much longer in the vicinity, because of their shortage of corn. And even supposing that events did turn out contrary to their expectations, still they had great seafaring strength, while the Romans had no skill with ships and no knowledge of the waters, harbors, or islands in the area where the campaign would take place. They also knew that navigating the great unbound ocean was quite a different matter from sailing in landlocked waters. These plans were adopted. The Veneti fortified their towns and gathered in the corn from the fields. They also assembled as many ships as they could at Venetia, where it was generally agreed that Caesar would begin his campaign. To fight this campaign, they made alliance with the Ocismi, Lexovi, Namnentes, Ambiliati, Marini, Diablintus, and Menapi. They also summoned assistance from Britain, which lies opposite those regions. Despite the difficulties of the campaign, which we have just set out, many factors nonetheless encouraged Caesar to undertake the war. The wrong they had done by detaining Roman citizens of equestrian rank, the revival of hostilities following their capitulation, the revolt following the surrender of hostages, and conspiracy among such a large number of states. Most of all, if their behavior was overlooked, the rest of the Gallic peoples might think they could act in a similar fashion. Caesar was aware that almost all Gauls are eager for political change, and because of their fickleness, are soon roused to war, and also that all men naturally long for liberty and despise a state of servitude. Thus, he decided to divide up his army and station it at wider intervals. He sent his legate, Titus Labienus, with the cavalry against the Treveri, who live close to the Rhine. Labienus's orders were to approach the Remi and the other Belgae and secure their loyalty, and to prevent the Germans, whom the Belgae were rumored to have summoned to their assistance, from trying to force a crossing over the river by boat. Caesar ordered Publius Crassus to take 12 legionary cohorts and a large force of cavalry, and set out for Aquitania, to prevent its peoples sending reinforcements to Gaul, and to stop these great nations joining forces. He sent his legate, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, with 3 legions to the Venelli, Curiosolate, and Lexovi, to ensure that their force was prevented from joining in. He put young Decimus Brutus in command of the fleet of the Gallic ships belonging to the Pictonus, Santoni, and the other conquered regions, which he had ordered to assemble. He ordered Brutus to set out as soon as possible against the Veneti. Caesar himself headed in the same direction, taking all the infantry with him. The sites of their towns were in general of this kind. They were placed on headlands projecting into the sea, and could not be approached on foot when the tide rushed in from the sea, as happened twice about every 12 hours. Nor could they be approached by ship at low tide, because then vessels would run into troubles in the shallows. So making an assault upon such a town, by either means, was an awkward business. For if at any time the Veneti became alarmed by the size of some siege works, or began to despair because the sea was kept out by the piling up of a massive breakwater as high as the town walls, then they would bring a large number of ships to land, a task at which they were especially skilled, take all their property out to sea, and sail off to the nearest town. There they would once again put up their defenses, with the same advantages of position. The Veneti continued to do this for a large part of the summer, all the more easily because our ships were held back by bad weather, and on the great expanse of the open sea, with its strong currents and few harbors, if any at all, navigation was especially difficult. So what's happened here? Let's take a moment to talk about it. Well, switch over so you guys can see me. The young Publius Crassus was a commander in Caesar's legions. That name might sound familiar. He is the son of Marcus Crassus, who is one of the first triumvirate including Caesar, Pompey, and of course Crassus himself. Crassus famously is the richest man in Rome. So, Publius Crassus is a very well-known individual. He is selected to go to a territory that is not very fertile and does not have a lot of natural supplies for the legion's winter. And so, of course, naturally what he does is he sends out emissaries to different tribes to try to secure a supply of grain that will support the legion throughout its stay. And the tribes around the ocean, so right now, for anyone who doesn't know, we're in the northwest of Gaul, the Veneti. We're up in the area of, I believe it's Brittany. And the other tribes we're talking about are in the Normandy area. The other tribes and the Veneti decide to arrest and detain and put into chains the Roman envoys. Now, why does this matter? Well, Caesar mentions it. Envoys, diplomats, these people doing these jobs are considered sacrosanct. You're not supposed to shoot the messenger, I guess, to put it in simple terms. There's supposed to be a deference given to people who are taking up this capacity and here to negotiate. They're not here to make war. They're here to negotiate. They're here to try to come to terms. Now, the reason he says the Gauls did this, of these tribes, because they had surrendered, they had made agreements with Caesar, and part of these agreements were they had surrendered hostages. And so these tribes were like, well, maybe if we take some Romans hostages, we can negotiate with Caesar and we'll get our men back and we can give him his people back. Which is a pretty short-sighted move, because Caesar points out immediately. He says, if we were to agree to these terms and basically let the other Gallic tribes know that they could just arrest people, they could have the negotiation advantage, and we would be back at the status quo with no advantages over the Gauls who we just conquered, then what have we done here? What have we accomplished in the past couple of years? So not only have they, committed the crime of arresting emissaries and people, he says, of equestrian rank, noblemen, essentially knights of Rome, but any attempt to negotiate with this is just going to be ending up in a losing position for Rome. Even if they get the people back who were captured, well, now they have no leverage over these tribes, and the negotiations they undertook, which they thought were in good faith, didn't mean anything. And so the war is just going to continue, and more likely than not, more tribes will get involved in this. And so Caesar sees the massive potential for the entire situation to have a domino effect. So he sends Labienus and several of his men over to the east, to the territory of the Belgae. If you were looking at our map before, that's in the northeast of Gaul. Talks to the Remi, who were an ally. He moves against the Treveri, who betrayed Caesar at the last battle. The Treveri were coming to help Caesar in the battle against the Nervi, but they saw that the camp of Caesar's was getting stormed, and instead of coming to help, the Treveri turned around and walked away. Imagine that. There's been a lot of betrayals already. He sends some men down to Aquitania, which is in the southwest. It's near the Pyrenees, so on the border with Spain. And he sends more men to the north to prevent the other tribes who have been engaged in this pact with the Veneti from actually physically sending reinforcements. And I think this is actually the most unique of the campaigns of the Gallic War, because it's forcing Caesar and the Romans to adapt to a situation in which they are wholly unfamiliar. The Romans were never good at naval combat. Even in the Punic Wars, they basically got their designs for the ships from the Punics. They found or they stole a ship, and they copied the design, and they added, the corvus, which is the like the pillar with the hook on it that would drop into an enemy ship, and it had like a horn, and it would grab onto it so they could jump over it. But that's also in the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean are very different bodies of water. The Veneti themselves, as we'll see very soon, have an entirely different design of ships. And in addition to this, the Veneti have towns and cities that he says, that Caesar mentions, are very hard to siege. Because they're out in the headlands, they're out basically towards the ocean, where if you try to siege them, then the tide comes in and it cuts off the land route, but at low tide it makes it difficult for ships to come in, so there's no really good way to set up a long-term siege of some of these towns. And even if the Veneti did feel threatened, there's nothing to stop them from just getting on their boats and sailing to another city and making the Romans do it all again. And so this is how it's going through the summer. The whole summer is this back and forth, and nothing's really happening. There's no conclusion being drawn here. And so we're going to see how the Romans have to adapt to this situation, which is, to be fair, wholly unique and heretofore unknown. And this is going to happen again in Britain. We'll see that later, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So let's get back to reading. All right. The ships of the Veneti were made and armed in the following way. The hulls were rather flatter than on our ships, to make negotiating the shallows and the ebb tides easier. The prows were very high, and likewise the sterns were fashioned to suit the size of the waves and the weather. The ships were made entirely of oak, to withstand any force or rough treatment. The cross timbers, which supported the decks, were made of planks a foot thick, fastened with iron bolts as thick as a man's thumb. The anchors were attached with iron chains instead of ropes. Instead of sails, they had skins and leather stretched very thin, either because they had no linen, or they did not know how to use it, or, what is more likely, because they thought that linen sails would not be able to withstand satisfactorily the terrible storms and gale-force winds of the ocean, and the great burden of the ships. The clash between their ships and our fleet revealed that only in speed and oarsmanship did our ships have the advantage, while in all other respects, their ships were better adapted and suited to the nature of the locality and the severity of the weather. Our ships were unable to harm theirs by ramming them. They were so strongly built, or, because of their height, to aim missiles at them with any success. For the same reason, when the wind began to whip up, they would run before it, and could endure a storm more easily, coming safely to rest in the shallows without fear of rocks or reefs if the tide left them behind. For our ships, on the other hand, every one of these eventualities was a matter of serious concern. Caesar had taken a number of the Veneti's towns by storm, but he realized that his great efforts were all in vain, for he could not check the enemy's flight by capturing towns, nor could he do them any damage. He decided to await the fleet. When it arrived, it was immediately spotted by the enemy. About 220 of the Veneti's ships, all properly equipped and rigged out with all kinds of weaponry, set out against our fleet. Between Brutus, who commanded the fleet, and the military tribunes and centurions who captained the individual vessels, there was no complete agreement over how to proceed or what plan of battle to adopt. They already knew that the ram could inflict no damage, and even if turrets were erected, still the sterns of the barbarian ships were even taller than these, so that our men could not aim missiles satisfactorily from their lower position, while those of the Veneti did all the more harm. One item, however, which our men had made ready in advance, proved to be of especial importance, namely sharpened hooks fixed into long poles, not unlike the kind of hooks used for pulling down walls in sieges. Using these hooks, our men seized the ropes binding the enemy yardarms to the masts and drew them tight. Then our ship quickly rowed away, and the ropes broke. Now that the ropes were snapped, the yardarms inevitably fell down. The hope of the Gallic ships had depended entirely on their sails and rigging. But when these were taken away, all the advantages of their fleet were removed at a stroke. The rest of the battle depended on courage, in which our soldiers were easily superior. All the more so because the fighting was before the eyes of Caesar, and the whole army, so that no action which was at all distinguished for bravery went unnoticed. Our army was positioned on all the hills and heights which offered a good view to the sea. Once the yardarms were broken, as we said, and 2 or 3 of our ships had surrounded each of the Venetes, our soldiers battled furiously to climb aboard the enemy vessels. When the barbarians realized what was happening and lost a number of ships, since no reinforcements were available for this action, they tried to seek safety in flight. Now all their ships were turned to sail with the wind, when suddenly a dead calm fell, and they were unable to sail away. This calm was certainly most timely in bringing the engagement to an end, for our men chased the enemy vessel and stormed it, and by nightfall almost none of their number had reached land, though the fighting had lasted from about the 4th hour until sunset. With this battle, the campaign against the Veneti and the whole of the coastal region came to an end. All the men capable of active service had assembled there, together with all the older men of sense or prestige. Moreover, they had gathered in one place every ship they possessed anywhere, and now the ships were all lost. They had no way of retreat left to them, nor any means of defending their towns. They therefore surrendered themselves and all their property to Caesar. Caesar decided that their punishment must be severe, to make these barbarian peoples uphold the law of nations more carefully in the future. So he executed all the Senate of the Veneti, and sold the rest of the people into slavery. While the campaign against the Veneti was in progress, Quintus Titurius Sabinus arrived in the territory of the Venelli, with the forces allocated by Caesar. The leader of the Venelli was called Viridovix. He held the supreme command over all the states which had defected, and had compelled them to provide an army and a large force. Within these few days, the Aulerci, Eberovicus, and Lexovi had put their senate to death for its reluctance to start a war. They closed their gates and joined forces with Viridovix. Also, there assembled from all over Gaul a huge mob of criminals and brigands who were diverted from farming and daily tasks by the hope of plunder and by their enthusiasm for fighting. Sabinus remained within the camp, which was well sited in all respects. Viridovix encamped facing him, barely 2 miles off, and each day led out his forces and offered Sabinus an opportunity to fight. Eventually, Sabinus not only began to be despised by the enemy, but was even sneered at by our own soldiers. He conveyed such an impression of fear that the enemy now dared to approach the rampart of the camp. His reason for acting in this way was the conviction that he ought not, as a subordinate, to engage with a great enemy host, especially in the absence of his supreme commander, except on even ground, or if some kind of opportunity arose. Once their belief in his cowardice was fixed, Sabinus chose a suitable man of intelligence, a Gaul, from among his auxiliary forces. With all kinds of promises and substantial rewards, Sabinus persuaded the man to go to the enemy and instructed him in what he wanted to happen. Posing as a deserter, the Gaul went to the Venelli and gave an account of the Romans' fear. He described how Caesar was in trouble, hard pressed by the Veneti, and how the following night, at the latest, Sabinus would secretly lead his army out of camp and set out to Caesar's assistance. When they heard this, the enemy all clamored that such an opportunity for favorable action should not be lost. They must make their way to Sabinus's camp. Many factors encouraged the Gauls to adopt this strategy. Sabinus's previous hesitancy, the deserters' corroboration, their shortage of rations. They had paid too little attention to this matter. Their hopes for the Venetic War, and the fact that men are generally ready to believe what they want to believe. Thus encouraged, they did not dismiss Veridovix and the other leaders from the meeting before they had their agreement to take up arms and march on the Roman camp. They rejoiced at this as if victory were already assured, gathered brushwood and faggots to fill up the Romans' ditches, and set off for the camp. The site of Sabinus's camp was on a hill, which sloped up gradually for about a mile. The Gauls made for it at top speed, so as to give the Romans as little time as possible to muster and arm themselves. When they arrived, however, they were out of breath. Sabinus spoke words of encouragement to his eager men, and gave the signal. While the enemy were hindered by the baggage they were carrying, Sabinus suddenly ordered a sortie from 2 of the gates. Thanks to the advantage of their position, the fatigue and lack of expertise of the enemy, the courage of our men, and their experience in previous battles, the result was that the Venelli did not even withstand our men's first attack, but turned tail. They were in difficulties. Our men, who were still fresh, pursued them as they fled and killed a large number. The cavalry pursued the rest. They left only a few who had got away from the rout. So at one and the same moment, Sabinus learned of the naval battle, and Caesar learned of Sabinus's victory. All the states at once surrendered to Sabinus, for the Gallic temperament is ready and eager to start wars, but their minds are soft and lacking in determination when it comes to enduring defeats. Wow. So a lot just happened here. We didn't stop in between these 2 events, so let's recap a bit of what happened. First, with some ingenuity, the Roman fleet managed to engage the Veneti fleet. Let me switch over to my camp so you can see me. So, Caesar mentions that the Veneti ships were in every way superior to the Roman ships, except for one, speed. That was the only advantage the Romans had. And the only tool that the Romans had with them that could be of any use were these long pikes with hooks in them, and which were normally used in sieges to help bring down sections of wall. And so Decimus Brutus and some of the other commanders had the idea that they could sail up close to the Veneti ships, launch these hooks at the rigging, and then sail away as fast as they could, which would pull the masts down, or the rigging on the mast down, essentially completely immobilizing the Gallic ships. And this worked. This actually worked. So talk about using the tools at your disposal. This was an incredible way to overcome a fleet which was in every way superior to the Roman fleet. And so because the whole strategy of the Veneti relied on their navy, and they no longer had this advantage, they were forced to surrender. And for the surrender, Caesar does 2 things, he says. He executes their senate. So all the senators, or the Veneti's equivalent to a senator, they're aristocrats, are put to death. They were the leaders who decided this course of action. He has them killed. All the Veneti property is seized, and the Veneti people themselves are sold into slavery. So this is the second time that Caesar has done something like this. The first, again, was against the Ottawatuki. We talked about it last time. And again, that was about after the Ottawatuki had surrendered, and then did a surprise attack with weapons they didn't give back to the Romans. And of course, they tried to overwhelm the Romans at night. They were defeated, and Caesar was like, no, we're not doing any of this. And he sold all of them into slavery. This again, he's basically saying, we had terms, we had peace, you've betrayed it, you're gone. So he gets them out of there. So that's what happens to the Veneti. The Venelli, or a little bit further to the east, they go against Sabinus in kind of a hilarious strategy. Sabinus pretends to be so scared that the Gauls are just laughing at him. They're walking up to the ramparts themselves freely and just causing havoc. And so he gets one of the Gallic auxiliaries, who is under his command, to pretend to defect. He goes over to the Gallic camp and convinces them that Sabinus not only is terrified, but he's planning to steal away the next night and march to Caesar's aid. And of course, they believe him immediately, with no doubts. So the Gauls come into attack. They bring up a bunch of things to siege the city, the camp, to set it on fire. And when they're close, Sabinus orders the signal to be given, and the Romans charge out and basically completely decimate the Gallic army, the Venelli army. And so he gets terms, the rest of the tribe surrender to him, and that's that. I think there's a lot of course, there's a lot of ingenuity on the part of the Romans, but you also see how Caesar's commanders handle things differently. We're going to be seeing another commander come up in just a second, Publius Crassus, in fact, and how he handles his situation. So Caesar mentioned this before, but his men, especially his commanders, while not all being fantastic or strategic geniuses, they were, some of them, very capable. None of them ever measured up to Labienus, which was unfortunate. None of them really came close. But they each were able to handle their situations in their own way. So let's go ahead and continue reading. Because there's one place we haven't talked about yet, and that is Aquitania. So let's get there. At about the same time, Publius Crassus had reached Aquitania. This land, was stated earlier, can be reckoned as 1/3 of Gaul in terms of both territorial size and population. He knew that he must wage war in places where, only a few years before, the legate Lucius Valerius Praeconinus, had been killed following a rout of his army, and where a proconsul, Lucius Malleus, escaped with his life after losing all the army's baggage. And he knew he needed to exercise no small degree of care. So he saw to it that the corn supply was secure, raised a force of auxiliaries and cavalry, and called up individually a number of brave men besides this from Tolosa and Narbo. These Gallic states are in the province very close to Aquitania. Then he led his army into the territory of the Sontiatus. The Sontiatus heard of Crassus's arrival and mustered a large force of men and horses. They were particularly strong in cavalry. Then they attacked the Roman column as it was on the march, and at first began a cavalry battle. But when their cavalry was routed and ours started to press the attack, they suddenly revealed their infantry, which had been posted in ambush in an enclosed valley. Their soldiers attacked and scattered our cavalry, and began the battle again. The fighting was fierce and long. The Sontiatus were confident because of past victories, and thought that the safety of all Aquitania depended on their bravery. Our men, on the other hand, were eager to show what their youthful leader could accomplish in the absence of his commander and the other legions. The enemy suffered heavy casualties and turned tail. Many of them were slain, and Crassus actually turned from his march and to begin besieging the town of the Sontiades. They resisted bravely, so he brought up the siege towers and movable shelters. At one point, the Aquitani attempted a sortie. Then at another, they took mines up to the earthworks and shelters. They are particularly skilled at mining, since they have mines and quarries in a number of sites. When the Aquitani realized that this was achieving nothing, thanks to the perseverance of our men, they sent envoys to Crassus and asked him to accept their surrender. Their request was granted, and they handed over their weapons as ordered. Our minds were all concentrated on this action. From another part of town, meanwhile, the commander, Adiatunus, attempted a sortie, together with 600 dedicated followers. These followers are called the Soldiri. They have a rule of life to share all their advantages with those to whom they are joined in friendship. If one of them comes to a violent end, they must either endure the same fate together with him or must commit suicide. Never within memory has it been found that one of them refused to die following the death of a man bound to him in friendship. With the attempted sortie, a cry went up from that part of the defenses. Soldiers ran to arms, and a fierce battle began. Adiatunus was forced back into the town. He then asked of Crassus similar terms of surrender, which Crassus granted. Crassus received weapons and hostages, and set out for the territory of the Vocatus and the Tarusates. When the barbarians heard that he had stormed a town with both natural and man-made defenses, and within a few days of his arrival, they were alarmed and sent envoys out in every direction. They began to hatch a plot, exchange hostages, and make ready their forces. They even sent envoys to nearer Spain, to the peoples closest to Aquitania, summoning reinforcements and leaders. When these arrived, they were now possessed of great authority and numbers, and tried to start a war. The leaders they chose were men who had served with Quintus Sertorius, right to the end, and who were considered to have immense expertise in military matters. In accordance with the Roman people's custom, these men began to occupy positions, fortify a camp, and cut our men off from supplies. Crassus became aware that his own forces were too small to be split up easily, while the enemy, though roaming about and blockading the roads, was still able to leave a sufficient garrison in camp. For this reason, the transport of corn and supplies was becoming difficult, and the enemy numbers were growing daily. So he decided to fight it out without delay. He referred his decision to a council, and when he realized that everyone supported his view, he decided to give battle the next day. At dawn, Crassus led out his entire force and stationed the men in a double line, putting the auxiliary in the center of the line. Then he waited to see what the enemy's decision would be. The Gauls thought that they could engage with impunity because of their great numbers and their long-established glorious reputation in warfare, and because our men were so few. Nevertheless, they decided it was safer to continue blockading the roads and cutting off supplies, and thus to seize victory without suffering harm. Moreover, they thought that if the Romans started to retreat because of their lack of corn, they could attack them while they were encumbered with baggage on the march, and hence in poor heart. The leaders of the Gauls approved this plan, and although the Roman forces were led out, they remained in camp. Crassus took note of the fact, but by delaying and appearing to be frightened, the enemy had made our men more eager to fight. They were all heard to shout, that there should be no delay in marching to the enemy camp. So Crassus spoke words of encouragement to all his men, and set out against the camp of the enemy. When they reached the camp, some of Crassus's men filled in the ditches, while others threw large numbers of missiles and forced the defenders back from the rampart and the defenses. He could not trust the auxiliaries sufficiently for battle, but he allotted them the task of supplying stones and missiles, and fetching turves from the Roman earthworks, so that they gave the appearance and impression of being fighting men. At the same time, the enemy fought fearlessly and without wavering, and the missiles they cast from their higher position did not fall in vain. Then some of our cavalry went around to the enemy camp and reported back to Crassus that the main gate at the back of the camp had not been fortified with equal care, and offered an easy means of entry. Crassus urged his cavalry officers to rouse their men with promises of great rewards. Then he explained what he wanted to happen. As ordered, they led out the cohorts which had been left to garrison our camp, and so were not worn out by exertion. The cavalry commanders took them by a somewhat roundabout route, to avoid being spotted from the enemy camp. But all eyes were turned to the battle, all minds concentrated upon it, and they swiftly reached the defenses we mentioned, demolished them, and took up position in the enemy camp before they even had clearly been observed, and before the enemy knew what was happening. Then a shout went up from that quarter, and our men, their strength renewed, began to fight more fiercely, as so often happens when there is hope of victory. The enemy were encircled on all sides, abandoned hope, and struggled to force a way through the defenses and seek safety in flight. The cavalry pursued them over the open plains, then returned to camp when night was far spent. Out of the total 50,000 men known to have assembled from Aquitania and Calabria, barely a quarter was left. Once news of the battle spread, most of the Aquitani surrendered to Crassus and handed over hostages of their own accord. These included the Tarbelli, Bigerionis, Tiani, Vocatus, Tarusatus, Elusatus, Gatis, Auski, Gerumni, Sibuzatus, and Cocosatus. A few of the most distant people, however, trusted to the onset of winter and failed to surrender like the rest. The campaigning season was almost over, but although all Gaul was now subdued, the Morini and Menopi still remained ready for war, and had never sent envoys to discuss peace. At almost the same time, therefore, Caesar decided that a war against them could be quickly concluded, and led his army against them. The Morini and Menopi, however, started the war with tactics very different from those employed by other Gauls. They realized that the mighty nations which had engaged in pitched battles had been routed and beaten. They, however, possessed woods and marshlands nearby, into which they shifted with all of their property. Caesar arrived at the borders of the woods and started building his camp. But during this time, there was not an enemy in sight. Then, when our men were spread out at work, the enemy suddenly rushed out of every part of the wood and attacked them. Swiftly, our men seized their weapons and forced the enemy back into the woods. A number of them were killed, but our men pursued too far into the impenetrable areas and lost a few of their comrades. Then, in the time remaining, Caesar had all the trees felled to prevent any lateral attack on his soldiers while they were unarmed and unawares. He had all the felled timber placed on the side facing the enemy, and built up as a rampart on either flank. In only a few days, a large space was cleared with unbelievable speed. Our men captured the enemy's cattle and the baggage at the rear. The enemy made for the depths of the forest. Then such storms arose that the tree felling had to be discontinued. The endless rain made it impossible to keep the soldiers any longer in tents, so they devastated the enemy's fields and set fire to their villages and buildings. After this, Caesar led his army back and stationed them for the winter among the Aulerci and Lexovi, and the other states which had so recently undertaken hostilities. Wow. And that's the end of Book 3. Can you believe it? Already 3 years have passed since we've started the Gallic War. Let's talk a little bit about what happened. So this final part concerning the year 56 happens in Aquitania. So that's the southwest. And Publius Crassus is going against the Aquitani tribes. Remember, Caesar told him to go down there to prevent any kind of domino effect happening from the Veneti. He immediately engages with one of the tribes, and he scores a decisive victory. There was a bit of a back and forth towards the end. There were some special soldiers, kind of like Gallic black ops, or however you'd like to call them. And they tried to disrupt the negotiations, but eventually they were killed and terms were reached. Now, the remaining Aquitani actually summoned reinforcements from nearer Spain. And many of the people they summoned actually were very well trained because they had served under a Roman, and he gives that Roman's name, Sertorius. Who is Sertorius? Well, Sertorius is very famous as perhaps the father, in some ways, of guerrilla warfare. Sertorius was a contemporary of Caesar's uncle, Gaius Marius. We remember, if we're reading, during the day we read some of Plutarch, and his accounts of Gaius Marius. He was a commander who was part of the Popularis faction. Guerrilla warfare, yeah. Guerrilla warfare, that's right. And when Marius was killed by Sulla, well, not really killed by Sulla, but he died, and then the Marian faction lost the civil war, Sertorius, who was part of that faction, went to Spain, and he fought against the Sullan forces, eventually coming into conflict with Pompey. Go figure. So Sertorius had, of course, his own forces who were Roman, who lived in the area, but he was also allied with many tribes in Spain. Eventually, of course, these Celto-Iberians betrayed Sertorius like clockwork. There's always a betrayal, and he was killed by his own allies. But he had effectively waged a guerrilla warfare against the Roman state under Sulla for years. And so, remember, this isn't too far away from that. We're just, I think less than 50 years on from that. So there are people alive still who received training or, at least participated under Sertorius. They understand his tactics, and they also understand the tactics of the Romans. So these aren't clowns. This isn't like the Menappi who were just hiding in their marshes like, oh, I hope the Romans don't find me. Oh, wait, they're cutting down the trees. These were hardened warriors who understood how to win. In fact, they do something that's quite rare. When Crassus leads his legions out to face them in battle, they say, well, we could fight him right now. We'd probably win. But we can also just continue to choke him out. We have more forces than him. We have seized control of all the supply lines. He can't get any more grain. We don't have to give battle here. That is kind of different, right? From a lot of the confrontations we've seen up until this point. And it's incredible to see how different areas are fighting in different ways, right? How the Veneti are different fighting from the Nervi, or the Nervi from the Helvetii, or the Helvetii from the Suebi, how the Germans fought, right? The Germans, if we go back to the Suebi and Area Vistus, remember, they were told by one of their sacred old women that, no, you can't fight until the next full moon or else you're going to lose. So they're like, oh, shit, we can't do it. We better stay back. And then Caesar was like, are you serious? So Caesar just literally walked up to them and made them fight, and they lost. Good job, Caesar. So, once again, the Romans are victorious. And Caesar in the very last page here was like, there's two people, or there's two groups, two tribes who haven't ever sent envoys to us. There's never been any talks of peace or negotiations or anything like that. The Monopi and the Morini. And the Monopi and the Morini are in the north. They're part of the Belgae, right? They're in the northeast. The Monopi are going to come up again later, so pay attention to that name. So Caesar marches against them. They abandon their towns. They run into the forests and into the marshes. There's a bit of... They try to pull what the Nervi tried to pull in the previous year. If you remember, the Nervi hid in the woods until the Romans started making their camp, and then they rushed out to attack them while they were busy. And the Romans almost lost that battle, to be fair. These guys tried the same thing, but apparently they were pretty bad at it. The only real losses happen when Caesar's men pursue too far into the forest, and then, you don't follow Gauls into the forest. You don't follow Germans into the forest. Augustus learned that at Teutoburg. It's not the right answer. Don't follow barbarians into their forests. Those are unholy places. Now, with this, it seems that Caesar has come to terms with almost all of Gaul. The Veneti are gone. They're no longer there. Caesar sadly doesn't mention what he does with the land, if he's allotting it to the other tribes who are in the area. Obviously, he wouldn't just make it Roman territory, because it'd be cut off and it would be an exclave, so it'd be a territory in the middle of nowhere, not attached, not sharing a border with the Republic's mainland. He could have settled other tribesmen in there. It's not clear what he did. Remember, for example, at the very beginning of the campaign, the Gallic War, when the Helvetii were coming out, he didn't want to leave the land of the Helvetii open, so he told the Helvetii, go back home. Go back to where you came from. Resettle your lands. I'll make agreements with the other Gallic tribes so they don't attack you, and then they, in fact, supply you with food and materials for building. Resow your lands. You're staying there. I assume that he probably did something similar in this case, because you wouldn't want wars popping up over empty land right away and the Gauls starting to fighting each other, I would assume. But I don't know. He doesn't say. And so where does that leave us? Well, I'll tell you where that leaves us. In 55 BC. 55. Wow. We're already in the 4th year. And this is probably the most controversial book. The controversial campaign of the Gallic War. But we're going to go over each thing that happens when we read this next week. And we're going to talk about them, the reasons they happened, and we're also going to talk about why certain decisions were made by Caesar and why they were made. Is this the part where the BBC is right? Absolutely not. I went on a rant about the BBC already. I hate them. I hate them so much. I hate Netflix. I hope you guys never watch their shows, never pay money to them. They should be ashamed of themselves, and so should everyone involved in those projects. They should be ashamed of themselves. I hope they can't sleep at night. I hope they have nightmares. Fuck them. The next chapter, I'll read you guys the title. AUC, so that's the year 699. We're almost in the year 700 by the Roman calendar. The consuls are Pompey and Crassus. So if you remember, there's the Lucca conference happens right here, right? The first triumvirate meets. They decide that Pompey and Crassus, who are enemies, they don't like each other, should run together for consul, and they win. So they're the consuls of this year. And so this is a critical year in Roman history, because what's happening, this is when Caesar, remember, was given command of his provinces for 5 years. And so he's like, hey, I'll support you guys for consul. In return, you got to get it so my command of Gaul, or Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum is extended for another 5 years. Why? Why does he do this? Well, Caesar was consul. Remember? And now he's a proconsul. But there's a law in Rome that you have to wait 10 years between your consulships. You can't just, if you win the consulship, you're consul for a year, you can't run again. So it's not like in the United States, we have a president for 4 years, and then they can run again immediately and become president and have a total, presidency of 8 years. That's not a thing. It's 1 year, and then you have to wait 10 years, and then you can run again. So Caesar is wanting to not come back to Rome until that 10 years has elapsed, and so he can become consul again. Why does he want to do this? Well, Caesar has a lot of enemies in Rome, and while he is in charge of a province, he is a proconsul, he has something called imperium. And imperium means he can't be charged in a court of law. So he can't be held to trial, and his enemies can't try to make up some trumped-up charges against him and get him arrested and things like that. So he's trying to keep up his command and not give his enemies in Rome a chance to usurp his position and the reforms that he's made. That's an entirely different story. We can talk about that later, but that's what's going on. This, of course, will work, so Caesar will get his command extended for 5 more years. We already know that part of it. But that's what's going on in Rome right now. Of course, things will deteriorate quite quickly in the city of Rome. And the title of this chapter is called The Invasion of the Euseppides and the Tencteri. Crossing of the Rhine, Caesar in Britain. That is huge. So in 1 year, all these events, we're going to read about all these events. There's going to be a German invasion, the Second Germanic Invasion. Of Ariovistus was just 2 years ago, 3 years ago at this point. And now we have another Germanic invasion. Not only is there going to be a Germanic invasion, but there's going to be a Roman invasion of Germany. The Romans will cross the Rhine for the very first time in history. And there's going to be a Roman invasion of Britain. Again, for the first time in history, the Romans will cross the English Channel and they will land in Britannia. All of this happens in a single year. This is insane. This is probably one of the most event-packed years, if not the most event-packed year in the course of the Gallic War. It's incredible. And I can't wait to read it with you guys. But we'll go ahead and save that for next time. As much as I would like to do it now, we would be here forever because I would keep stopping and telling you guys things. We don't need that. Okay. So, everybody, I hope you like the face cam now. So I'm trying to use this more so when I'm taking breaks from the text and telling you guys kind of events and trivia, surrounding these things about the people in them, that there's a bit more of an obvious break, so you're not just staring at the map that's going through Gaul. So I hope you like that. You guys can let me know. If you're watching this on YouTube, everyone say hi, YouTube. Remember to follow. And, or you don't follow on YouTube, excuse me, you subscribe on YouTube. Remember to subscribe, hit the like button. And you can also come over to Twitch, twitch.tv/authorvalentine. You can follow me here, and you can subscribe here as well as you like. It's greatly appreciated if you do both. Hit all the damn buttons, the chat says. That's right. Next week, we're going to be going ahead and covering what I just mentioned. Until then, all of you have a blessed week and weekend. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for all the support you all continuously give me. I'm sure many of you are just as upset as I am at this news from BBC and all this crap that these people are doing and attempting to rewrite history. It's terrible. But we'll talk more about that next week. Maybe I'll make a separate video about it because I have more to say. I just don't want to I don't want to get into it too much right now. With that, again, thank you everybody so much for hanging out with me today. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.